Cold air pressed against the crawl space as a flashlight beam settled on a cardboard box, dust lifting like breath. Inside, a cassette tape rested alone, unlabeled, its plastic warped by heat and years, waiting in silence to speak after too forgotten. Decades beneath a winter attic in Atlanta, Georgia, quietly. If you like stories like this, make sure to subscribe and like the video. In December of 1986, Atlanta was moving through the familiar rhythm of the season, the city strung with lights, shopping centers crowded, and cold rain slicking the roads that cut between brick neighborhoods and aging bungalows. Missing person flyers had already begun to curl on telephone poles near DeKalb Avenue, their staples rusting in the damp air. The woman on those flyers was 23 years old, recently graduated, newly employed, and living alone for the first time in a modest rental near Grant Park. Her name appeared briefly in the local papers, then vanished under holiday headlines and year-end crime summaries. The case never made national news. It barely stayed alive in city memory. Her disappearance was reported on December 18th, 3 days before Christmas, when she failed to appear for work at a downtown insurance office. Co-workers assumed travel delays or illness. By the time police entered her apartment, the tree she had purchased leaned undecorated in the corner, lights still boxed. Dishes sat clean and drying. No signs of struggle were documented. Her purse was missing. Her car remained parked on the street, dusted with pine needles from an overhanging tree. Initial police reports listed the case as a voluntary absence, a designation that quietly deprioritized resources. Atlanta, in the mid-1980s, carried a complicated law enforcement burden. The city was still reshaping itself after years of high-profile violence and institutional strain. Detectives rotated quickly. Cold cases formed early and froze permanently. Her family pressed for answers, but the calendar moved faster than investigators. By New Year's Eve, her disappearance was folded into a stack of unresolved files, the paper edges already yellowing. The first tangible break came not from a tip, but from weather. On January 4th, 1987, hikers reported a disturbed patch of ground off a maintenance trail near the South River, an area known more for discarded furniture than foot traffic. The body recovered there matched the missing woman. Exposure and time had erased clarity, but the autopsy suggested death within days of disappearance. No obvious fatal injuries were recorded. The cause was listed as undetermined, a common classification. When evidence decays faster than answers form, the case officially became a homicide investigation without a suspect. Evidence collection followed the standards of the era. Fibers were logged, soil samples were taken, photographs were developed and stored in envelopes labeled by hand. There was no DNA database to consult, no digital mapping to reconstruct movement. Witness canvassing yielded little. A neighbor recalled hearing a car idle late one night. Another remembered a man knocking on doors asking about a lost dog. None of it formed a prosecutable line. By February, the investigation slowed. Detectives moved on. The family buried their daughter under gray skies, the service quiet, the pastor careful with words. The city returned to routine. Years passed. The cassette tape discovered decades later was not found by police. It surfaced during a routine estate clearing in 2011, when the original homeowner of a nearby property passed away. The house, a narrow two-story with sagging steps, had been rented intermittently during the 1980s, in the attic. Beneath insulation darkened by age, the box was overlooked until a contractor lifted it down. Inside were old receipts, a scarf, and the tape. The tape eventually reached authorities through a family member who recognized a name scribbled faintly on the box lid, a name that appeared in the old case file as a peripheral interview subject. When investigators played it, the audio was degraded but intact. It contained a recording of a man speaking alone, recounting events in fragments, never naming the woman directly, but describing a night in December, an argument, a drive south, and panic after something went wrong. The voice matched no confession style. It was not dramatic. It was wary. For cold case detectives, the tape became a roadmap. They cross-referenced the voice with archived interviews. Advances in forensic audio analysis allowed voice pattern comparison. The match was not absolute, but it was strong enough to justify reopening the file. Subpoenas followed. Old addresses were revisited. One former tenant of the attic house, now living quietly in rural Alabama, came back into focus. Records showed he had known the victim casually through a community volunteer program. His original interview in 1986 was brief, unremarkable. He had an alibi supported by a co-worker who later recanted under renewed questioning. Phone records, once impossible to reconstruct, were now partially recoverable through billing archives. A call placed from a payphone near Grant Park on the night of disappearance linked to his workplace account. Physical evidence was re-examined. Fibers collected from the body matched upholstery from a car he owned at the time, confirmed through manufacturer records. Soil analysis aligned with the river trail area, a location he had listed years earlier as a frequent fishing spot. None of this alone was decisive. Together, they formed a narrative that could withstand court scrutiny. The arrest came quietly in November, just before Thanksgiving, 25 years after the crime. There were no cameras, no press conference. The indictment detailed the chain of evidence carefully, acknowledging the passage of time while asserting continuity. At trial, the tape was played once. The courtroom remained still. Jurors listened to a man unknowingly preserving his own undoing. The verdict arrived in December, during another season of lights and cold rain. Guilty. The sentence reflected both the severity of the crime and the years elapsed. Life imprisonment with parole consideration was imposed under statutes in effect at the time of offense. In the aftermath, the victim's family returned to the courthouse steps briefly, then withdrew again into private life. The house with the attic was sold. The tape was sealed into evidence storage, catalogued properly at last. Atlanta moved forward, as cities do, but the case closed, a quiet space left open since 1986. Justice, delayed and imperfect, finally settled into the record where it would remain. Unspoken but no longer unresolved. The reopening of the file required rebuilding an investigation from paper that had absorbed decades of humidity and neglect. Boxes were pulled from municipal storage rooms where fluorescent lights hummed over steel shelves, each folder stamped with dates that placed them firmly in another era of policing. Detectives approached the case slowly, aware that time magnifies mistakes as much as it erases memory. Every report was reread, every photograph re-examined for context that earlier eyes had missed. The victim's life was reconstructed with restraint and discipline. She had arrived in Atlanta from a smaller southern town after college, drawn by steady work and independence. She volunteered twice a month, attended church irregularly, and spent holidays with relatives outside the city. Phone records from 1986 showed brief calls, mostly practical, no indication of distress. Her bank account activity ended abruptly. After mid-December, a silent time stamp that confirmed investigators' long-held assumptions about timing. The suspect's early proximity now carried new weight. Employment records showed he worked maintenance for several properties in the area, including the rental where the cassette tape was eventually discovered. His access patterns explained his familiarity with crawl spaces and storage areas. At the time of disappearance, he was 32, divorced, and known to keep irregular hours. None of this had been considered actionable in 1986. In hindsight, it mapped opportunity. Cold case methodology demanded corroboration beyond inference. Investigators sought surviving witnesses, knowing memories would be brittle. Some could not be found. Others remembered only impressions. One former co-worker recalled a sudden change in demeanor shortly after Christmas that year, a withdrawal that had seemed like seasonal fatigue at the time. A neighbor from the suspect's former residence remembered a vehicle parked late one night with its engine running, headlights off, during a heavy December rain. These details, once insignificant, now aligned with the timeline described on the tape. The forensic review extended to physical artifacts, long sealed. Fibers preserved on slides were compared using updated microscopy. The upholstery match did not produce a singular identification, but it narrowed the field convincingly. Soil samples were tested with modern geochemical profiling, revealing mineral compositions consistent with the South River Trail. Chain of custody documentation was intact, allowing admission. The strength of the case rested on accumulation, not spectacle. Investigators also examined what had not been done. The original classification of voluntary absence delayed early searches. Patrol logs showed missed opportunities for canvassing during the critical first 48 hours. These acknowledgements were included in internal reviews, not to assign blame, but to contextualize delay. The law required honesty with the jury about the passage of time and its consequences. The suspect's later life offered no dramatic turns. He had relocated, remarried briefly, then settled into a solitary routine. There were no subsequent violent charges. This absence of pattern was addressed directly by prosecutors, who emphasized that many offenders never repeat and that one act can remain isolated yet decisive. Financial records showed stability. No sudden windfalls. No confessions. Only the tape, preserved accidentally, bridging past and present. When the suspect was interviewed again, investigators adhered strictly to protocol. No coercion. No confrontation beyond evidence presentation. He denied wrongdoing, questioned the tape's origin, and suggested it was a private recording unrelated to the case. Experts testified later that the content aligned with known facts unavailable to the public at the time, including route descriptions and environmental conditions. The rain mentioned matched weather records. The timing matched phone logs. Media coverage remained subdued. Local papers ran brief articles noting the arrest, careful not to overstate certainty. For an older audience, the story resonated quietly, echoing unresolved cases they remembered from their own years in the city. Letters to editors reflected cautious approval, an understanding that justice sometimes arrives without fanfare. The trial preparation focused on clarity. Prosecutors avoided emotional language. The narrative was presented chronologically, supported by documents and expert interpretation. Defense strategy centered on time erosion, arguing that memories fade and evidence degrades. The judge allowed extensive voir dire to ensure jurors understood the challenges inherent in delayed prosecution during proceedings. The cassette tape was contextualized, not dramatized. Audio engineers explained degradation patterns, continuity markers, and why editing was unlikely. Voice comparison analysts outlined probability without absolutism. The jury was instructed to consider the tape as one component among many. Witnesses testified to records rather than recollection where possible. Phone company archivists described billing practices of the 1980s. Medical examiners discussed limitations of the original autopsy while explaining how cause of death could remain undetermined yet consistent with criminal agency. Investigators described procedural steps with professional detachment. As December progressed, the courtroom windows reflected early darkness. Jurors listened, took notes, and asked clarifying questions through the judge. There were no emotional displays. The tone remained measured. When deliberations concluded, the verdict reflected acceptance of the cumulative case. The legal standard of proof beyond reasonable doubt was met through convergence of independent evidence streams. Sentencing considered statutory frameworks in effect at the time of offense, as required by law. In the weeks that followed, administrative closure tasks continued. Evidence was files were digitized. The case summary was entered into departmental training materials as an example of delayed resolution achieved through preservation and patience for the victim's family. The outcome provided a form of resolution without restoration. They declined interviews, issuing a brief statement through counsel, expressing gratitude for diligence and respect for privacy. Atlanta entered another holiday season. Streets glowed again. The South River Trail saw new signage and maintenance. The forgotten tape returned to controlled storage, its unintended role complete. The investigation ended not with celebration, but with records updated, responsibilities fulfilled, and a long-standing absence finally accounted for in the city's quiet archives. With the verdict entered into the record, the case moved into its final administrative phase, a period that rarely attracts attention but defines how justice is preserved long after courtrooms empty. Clerks updated docket numbers that had originated in a different century. Evidence seals were checked, photographed, and re-signed. The cassette tape, once forgotten beneath insulation and dust, was now labeled with precision, its chain of custody extending backward across decades, then forward into permanent archival control. The legal reasoning behind the conviction was documented carefully. Prosecutors summarized how circumstantial evidence, when interlocked, forms a structure as sound as direct testimony. The appellate window opened and closed without challenge. Defense counsel filed no motions disputing admissibility or procedure. The case stood, legally intact. For a system often criticized for delays and failures, the resolution carried institutional significance. Attention turned briefly to reviewing how the investigation had been revived. Cold case units across Georgia requested internal summaries, not for publicity but for instruction. The Atlanta Police Department compiled a technical report detailing how legacy evidence, when preserved properly, could remain viable. Particular emphasis was placed on analog media, an artifact category often overlooked during digitization initiatives. The report noted that private recordings, never intended for law enforcement discovery, could hold contextual truth unmatched by formal statements. The victim's name appeared again in print, this time in retrospective coverage. Local journalists framed the story with restraint, mindful of fatigue among readers who had lived through decades of unresolved crime. Articles referenced the seasonal timing, how her disappearance occurred amid Christmas preparations, and how resolution came during another winter. The tone was reflective rather than dramatic, acknowledging that time alters not only evidence but public expectation. For residents who remembered the winter of 1986, the case reopened personal time. Letters arrived at the courthouse from individuals who had volunteered during the original search. Some now retired, some no longer living in the city. They wrote of walking wooded paths in rain, of stapling flyers, of believing answers would come quickly. The replies they received were brief acknowledgements, official and polite, yet they mattered. The suspect entered the state correctional system quietly. Intake photographs replaced older driver's license images. Medical evaluations recorded age-related conditions rather than acute issues. He was assigned to a facility appropriate for long-term sentences, far from the city where the crime occurred. There were no statements of remorse recorded publicly. The system documented compliance and adjustment, as it does for every inmate. Without editorial dot, the victim's apartment building still stood, renovated but recognizable. New tenants passed through hallways unaware of the history contained within those walls. The street outside had been resurfaced. Trees planted since the 1980s now cast broader shadows. Urban continuity masked earlier absence. The location where her car had remained parked no longer bore distinguishing features. Time had repurposed space efficiently. Investigators involved in the reopened case returned to other files. Cold casework rarely offers sequential resolution. It requires compartmentalization, the ability to close one narrative and reopen another without emotional overlap. Those detectives carried forward procedural lessons rather than personal satisfaction. Interviews conducted later emphasized discipline over intuition, patience over urgency. The cassette tape itself prompted broader discussion within evidence management circles. Training sessions addressed how non-traditional evidence should be evaluated, stored, and revisited. The medium's limitations were acknowledged alongside its strengths. Audio distortion, incomplete context, and potential misinterpretation required expert handling. In this case, corroboration anchored interpretation. Without supporting records, the tape would have remained ambiguous. The courthouse where the verdict was delivered continued its routine schedule. Holiday wreaths were removed from doors. Calendars turned. Other cases filled the docket. Yet the file number associated with the 1986 disappearance was now marked closed. A rare annotation among thousands labeled inactive. That designation carried weight beyond statistics. Family members marked the conclusion privately. There were no public ceremonies, no memorials unveiled. They visited the gravesite once more during early winter, when grass thinned and the ground hardened. Closure did not alter loss, but it stabilized it, allowing memory to exist without unanswered questions pressing against it. In the broader context of criminal justice, the case reaffirmed that resolution does not require spectacle. It requires continuity, preservation, and willingness to revisit assumptions. The original investigators had worked within the constraints of their time. The later team operated with expanded tools but equal restraint. The bridge between them was documentation. Atlanta's local archives retained copies of the final judgment, the appellate waiver, and the investigative summary. Scholars studying late 20th century policing would later cite the case as an example of delayed accountability achieved through methodical review rather than technological breakthrough alone. The forgotten tape mattered, but only because it was interpreted within a disciplined framework. As winter deepened, seasonal news cycles shifted focus to weather advisories and year-end retrospectives. The case slipped from headlines. That disappearance from public view mirrored its initial fading decades earlier. But this time, the silence carried resolution rather than uncertainty. The South River Trail, where the body had been found, underwent minor redevelopment, with improved signage and maintenance. No marker referenced the past discovery. Law enforcement policy discouraged memorialization at recovery sites, preferring preservation of public utility over symbolic designation. The ground remained neutral, serving hikers and maintenance crews alike. The final administrative act occurred when the cold case unit updated its clearance rate statistics. One more line was added, dated accurately, reflecting a crime solved long after commission. For an audience that had watched cities change and systems evolve, the statistic mattered less than the principle it represented. Time did not erase responsibility. The case concluded without spectacle, fitting the manner in which it had unfolded. Records were complete. Evidence was secured. The law had spoken within its bounds. What remained was memory, stabilized by fact, resting quietly where speculation once lived. In the years following the conviction, the case settled into a different kind of existence, one defined less by investigation and more by record. The file no longer moved between desks or generated internal reminders. It occupied a fixed position in the archive, catalogued alongside other resolved homicides, its spine stamped with a closure date that carried quiet authority. For those who worked in records management, this transition marked the true end of the case. The cold case unit conducted a final internal review, not to revisit guilt, but to assess process. They examined how the original investigation had been shaped by the tools and assumptions of 1986, a period when missing adult women were often misclassified and early momentum lost. This review did not assign fault to individuals. Instead, it documented institutional context, emphasizing how changes in training and policy since that era had altered response protocols. The report was circulated internally and then stored. Another layer of documentation reinforcing the permanence of the outcome. Outside law enforcement, the story reached a smaller, more reflective audience. Retired men who had lived in Atlanta during the 1980s recognized the cadence of the narrative. They remembered that winter, the rain instead of snow, the way Christmas decorations looked dimmer under overcast skies. For them, the case echoed unresolved news clippings tucked into memory. Its resolution did not shock. It reassured. It suggested that unfinished business could still be addressed, even after decades. The legal finality also carried implications for evidence preservation statewide. Grant funding proposals cited the case when arguing for continued support of analog media storage and digitization. The cassette tape, once an afterthought, became an example in policy discussions about non-traditional evidence. Training modules referenced it without embellishment, focusing on how patience and corroboration prevented misinterpretation. The victim's name gradually appeared in academic footnotes and professional conferences rather than headlines. Criminology students studied the timeline as a demonstration of how circumstantial evidence accrues weight through consistency. Law students examined the admissibility arguments, noting how courts balance fairness with the realities of delayed prosecution. The case lived on in these controlled environments, stripped of emotion, reduced to structure and outcome. The man convicted grew older in custody. His intake file updated periodically with routine evaluations. His parole eligibility, defined by statute, became a distant administrative milestone rather than a public event. Victim notification systems ensured the family would be informed of any future hearings, though none occurred in the immediate years after sentencing. The system moved predictably, as designed. Atlanta itself continued its transformation. Neighborhoods near the victim's former apartment saw new development. Restaurants replaced older storefronts. Traffic patterns shifted. The physical markers tied to the case eroded naturally, absorbed into urban change. Only official records retained precise addresses and dates, anchoring the narrative against the city's constant motion. During one winter anniversary of the verdict, a local columnist wrote briefly about the case, framing it as an example of restrained justice. The piece avoided names, focusing instead on process and patience. It concluded that closure does not announce itself loudly, and that its value lies in quiet certainty rather than emotional release. The column ran once and was archived, consistent with the case's overall tone within the victim's extended family. Younger relatives learnt of the case not through media but through careful explanation. They were told facts without speculation, outcomes without dramatization. The family chose accuracy over myth, a decision that mirrored the investigative approach that ultimately resolved the case. Memory became factual rather than imagined. The courthouse where the trial concluded remained unchanged in function. Files moved through clerks' hands. Judges rotated assignments. Jurors continued to file in and out, performing civic duty without awareness of past proceedings in the same rooms. The case left no physical trace there beyond a docket entry. Yet it contributed quietly to the institution's continuity. From an investigative standpoint, the case reinforced the principle that resolution does not always require new technology. It requires revisiting what already exists with disciplined perspective. The forgotten tape was not powerful because it was dramatic, but because it aligned with independent evidence. It did not replace investigation. It completed it. As time passed, the cold case unit added new names to its active list. Other families waited. Other files aged. The solved case served as a reference point, a reminder that persistence could yield results even when years intervened. It did not create unrealistic expectations. It provided measured hope grounded in procedure. The final administrative act occurred when the department conducted a routine purge of outdated storage facilities. Items eligible for destruction were reviewed carefully. The cassette tape was exempted permanently, flagged as historically significant evidence. It was transferred to a climate-controlled archive, its physical form preserved even as its relevance shifted from prosecution to record. In the end, the case did not conclude with revelation or spectacle. It concluded with alignment. Evidence matched record. Record matched outcome. The uncertainty that had defined the winter of 1986 was replaced by documented fact. The city absorbed this quietly, as cities do. What remained was a closed file, a lawful conviction, and a recognition that time does not eliminate responsibility. It only delays acknowledgement. In that sense, the forgotten tape found in an attic did not resurrect the past. It clarified it, allowing the record to stand complete, stable, and finally at rest.